foliage. Can you see? Can you see all the beautiful yellow golden trees?
That is so lovely. Wonderful. Looking forward to meeting you in New Hampshire.
That's right.
So can we just wait for a couple of minutes? Our guests are arriving.
Oh, 48 participants. My goodness. And who are these people?
Well, mostly our students and Turkey's American Studies community. We have 9 American Studies departments all across Turkey, and we have participants from all these American Studies departments, academics and their students.
Well, you probably know more about the United States than most Americans do. Should I put my share screen on now?
Just a couple of more minutes.
Okay.
I will do an opening speech.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Tomashow, a brief one, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, Jem, shall I start?
Yes, I think we're pretty much here. We have 55 people and we can start.
Thank you so much. Dear colleagues, dear students, dear American Studies community of Turkey, and dear guests, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to AKE Colloquium 2021, organized by Hacettepe University's Department of American Culture and Literature. I'm Ufuk Özdağ, the chair of the American Studies Department. We will be hosting other speakers this academic year, but we're delighted to be hosting this first event of the academic year with Professor Mitchell Tomashow this afternoon. Those of you who are connecting from the United States, good morning. Our tech master is Dr. Cem Kılıçarslan today. Cem is a dear friend and a long-time colleague in the department. Thank you so much, Cem. Shortly, I will be introducing our guest of honor, Professor Tomashow, but first a few words on the AKE Colloquium events. Why we named these events AKE Colloquium? Let me briefly explain. Well, the root of colloquium is the Latin loqui, meaning to talk. So we want this to be a meeting where the speaker will be interacting with the audience. We want participation from you all following the talk. Professor Mitchell Tomashow is connecting from New Hampshire, where it is 9 o'clock in the morning. He's a writer, ecological educator, and former president of Unity College in Maine. And he will be talking about his latest book, To Know the World. His book, To Know the World, is globally important today. And we Turkish people, we really need to know the world. We are finally coming to terms with the wanton exploitation of the lands. Finally, we have started understanding that our natural resources were not inexhaustible. We as literature scholars, we need to draw attention to massive environmental problems There is the threat of drought more severely every other year. There's massive deforestation in our lands. Soil erosion is another threat that our lands face. Another pressing environmental concern is the collapse of fisheries in our waters, the biodiversity loss in our once abundant waters. Another topic of urgency is the drainage of wetlands. Wetlands as large as the Marmara Sea have been drained, leading to enormous losses, including losses in our waterbird populations. We saw immense wildfires across Turkey this past summer, and most stemmed from the extreme heat and associated drought across the country. I don't even want to mention what happened to our inland sea, the Marmara. That's a big tragedy, and we won't get over it for years. It's once crystal clear waters, no more. A huge blow to fishing. In the face of all these deepening environmental crises, we need to make this environmental turn urgently. We need to learn how to perceive our lands and waters. And as Professor Tomaszów says, we need a deeper understanding of the world. That's why I think we are gathered here today. Well, let me introduce our guest of honor. Professor Mitchell Tomaszów devotes his life and work to promoting ecological awareness and environmental learning. Currently, his passions are teaching, writing, and advising, cultivating opportunities and exchanges that transform how people engage with environmental learning and sustainability. With his books, he's helping us see the natural world with sharp eyes. Professor Tomaszów was the president of Unity College in Maine. With his management team, he integrated concepts of ecology, sustainability, natural history, wellness, and community service into all aspects of college and community life. Professor Tomaszów was also the chair of the Environmental Studies program at Antioch University, New England. His 4 books have significantly influenced environmental studies education, To Know the World, The 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus, Bringing the Biosphere Home, and Ecological Identity. My students are familiar with his Bringing the Biosphere Home, as the book was my textbook in several of my literature and environment classes. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Professor Tomaszów. And a note to our participants, please put your comments or questions in the chat box. Professor Tomaszów will address them at the end of his presentation. The microphone is yours, Dr. Tomaszów. We are delighted to have you with us today.
Well, thank you. And I ask you, how much time do I have before we want to open it up for questions?
Well, at least 1 hour, let's say, okay. Professor Tomaszów.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and now my second appearance at Hacettepe, I hope I'm saying it correctly, University. It's wonderful, and I'm just sorry that I can't be with you all because there's something missing when you do it via Zoom. It's so great to see other people and to get you to feel your spirit and your aspiration and your intention. But this is the best we have, and so this is what we'll do. But I'm greatly honored to be here and delighted to have the opportunity. So we'll do the share screen, and I'll get us launched here. Okay, but I have to put play on. All right, can everyone see the screen okay? All right. Well, I'm going to take you on a long journey through this book, and I know that I'm from New York originally, so I have a bit of an accent, and the more excited I get about what I'm speaking about, the more quickly I speak. So I'll try to slow myself down because of the translation issue as best I can, but I may not be able to completely control myself because it comes out of enthusiasm for the ideas and the material and my aspiration, which is to share this all with you. So I'm going to tell you about this book, but I want to start by looking at my whole portfolio of work and how they all lead to this one, and then we'll go into this one in more depth. The first book I wrote was called Ecological Identity, and then followed by Bringing the Biosphere Home and the 9 Elements of the Sustainable Campus. And with Ecological Identity, that was in '95, I was really interested in why people chose the environmental field, what was really behind it. And it was clear to me that how they related to nature was crucial to their identity formation. And that, in fact, the focus for almost all that they chose to do in their personal and professional lives. So I wrote a whole book about that process and how, when you're involved in studying environment and integrating yourself with the natural world, how does that change your behavior and your personality and your values and how you think about politics and education. And then in 2001, I wrote a book called Bringing the Biosphere Home. I was very concerned at that time about, as we all are and still are, about the biodiversity crisis and the 6th mega extinction and climate change. It was clear to me, though, that it was very hard for people to perceive these changes. So this book is about how to better understand and how to better perceive global environmental change. And the thesis of the book essentially is that if you can more carefully understand and look at the natural history of the place where you live, you'll be better able to understand the broader, bigger changes in space and time. Also, I was very concerned about some of the existential and spiritual challenges involved in studying the biosphere. So this book covers those things as well. And I, without wanting to sound egotistical, I think this book is as relevant now as it was 20 years ago. I think you could read this and it wouldn't feel at all timeless or dated. And then I wrote a book in 2013 called The 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus. And the idea of this book, I spoke about it at Hashatepa a couple of months ago, I believe. The idea of this book is that to really attain a sustainable campus, you have to look at everything on the campus. It's a comprehensive strategic orientation that's necessary. And over the course of time, between 2011 and up until COVID, I've probably visited around 60 campuses in North America to discuss this book and other things as well. Because the campus sustainability movement in North America really has taken off in ways that are very hopeful and I'm optimistic about. But now let's get to know the world. And this is a book in 9 chapters. I'm going to go through each of them with you, but I'm really going to focus the most on the middle of the book, the chapters 5, 6, and 7, constructive connectivity, which is about social and ecological networks, migration, which I think is easily the most challenging and pertinent environmental issue of our time, and what I call cosmopolitan bioregionalism, which is really about how we think about the relationship between local and global, urban and rural, and what all of that means. I'll look at the other aspects of the book as well, but mostly I'm going to focus on those chapters because I think they're all connected and it'll give us a chance to go into more depth around some of those issues. But first, I want to step back in time a little bit just to help explain my own orientation and my background. I'm 71 years old. My mother actually was born in Cyprus and came to the United States when she was 9 years old. She spoke no English. She spoke a little bit of Turkish and a little bit of Greek and a little bit of Hebrew because these were Russian Jews who were not allowed into the United States. And half the family came to New York and the other half went to Israel. All my grandparents are Russian Jews. My grandmother came to the States when she was 13 years old on her own. There were relatives here apparently. So I'm the only 1 or 2 generations removed from immigrant families. And there's a lot to be said about that, which I won't go into now, but I do discuss in the book. But I'm a child of the late 60s, and that was a very influential time for me. We had all these incredible social movements and political movements in the United States between, let's say, the early 60s and the early 70s. We have, of course, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the peace movement, and the environmental movement. And all of these proliferated at this time. So as a young college student, I was fascinated by all of this and very engaged in all of it as well. And of course, at that time, there was no internet. So I would go to the 8th Street bookstore in Lower Manhattan. I was going to university in New York City. And I saw this book, The Whole Earth Catalog, and I opened it up and I was just amazed at what it contained. And in many respects, this became my own curriculum as an educator and as a university president, to implement a lot of the things that I saw in this book, which stuck with me over the years. I always, at the start of any presentation, remind people, of course, this is North American centric, but I remind people of how beautiful this planet is, and what a magnificent jewel it is, and how hard it is for us to keep this image in our head during our daily lives. But I think this is an image we do need to keep in our minds, because it just reminds us of just the swirls of atmospheric and oceanic circulations, the extraordinary jewel this planet is. And it's so easy to forget all of that. And I also like to remind people why we do this, why I wrote this book, why we have environmental studies programs, why we have sustainability programs, because in my view, learning how to perceive global environmental change is the crucial educational challenge of our lives. And just to briefly review, and also to put into context some of the comments that Ufuk was making, in my view, these are the challenges. The 6th mega extinction. We have had 5 mega extinctions during the history of life on Earth. They were caused by a range of factors, from meteor strikes to continental drift, to changing geochemical matrices. But the 6th mega extinction is human caused, and we're in the early days of it. And it is a huge, huge challenge for all of us, both ecologically and existentially. It's of course accompanied by plunging declines in biodiversity, and what I like to describe as rapidly changing atmospheric and oceanic circulations. And rapidly changing means that these circulations are changing at rates that are pretty unprecedented from our own understanding of the geological records, and along with those are these biogeochemical imbalances. So this is the challenge that we face, and we're easily distracted from it for a variety of different kinds of reasons. But really, this is what ought to be front and center for all of us. And on top of all that, these concerns are connected to other pertinent issues: economic opportunity, social justice, healthcare, racism, violent conflict, global poverty. But the connections between these issues and the ecological fate of the planet are not easily perceived. So I will ask the question of you: what is the role of environmental studies in making those connections more clear? And a subset of that question is, what is the role of American studies in making those connections more clear? So that's part of what I cover in this book. And the tides of change, which is the 3rd chapter, I go into some of these connections and challenges in much more detail, but I want to name them for you. And in my view, these all are revitalizations of the challenges that we faced in the 60s. So, this has been a 60-year process, but if anything, all of these challenges have become even more intense or more egregious. So these are the 4 conditions that are all connected. And by the way, I would say, for the purpose of American studies, what I'm noticing now in the environmental movement in North America is that most of the younger folks, that is people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, from my perspective, understand all these relationships, that almost any activist organization is going to be dealing with all of these questions simultaneously. But for a long time, environmental issues were separate, and they were part of condition 1, which I describe as the rapacious exploitation of the biosphere and its life systems. And our challenge is, how do we best communicate the necessity of ecosystem thinking? Condition 2 is the increasing disparity between rich and poor. How do we promote economic equity and social justice in cultures of materialism and entitlement? Condition 3 is the apprehension concerning the integration and separation of global cultures. How do we promote intercultural understanding and cosmopolitan thinking in the midst of nationalist responses and ethnic chauvinism? This is easily manipulated by demagogues, by the way, and the nationalist revival, it's in large measure can be explained by the fears that so many people have about people moving between nations, but that's an issue we'll get into later on in this presentation. And then condition 4, violence, weapons, and terror compete with deliberation, diplomacy, and collaboration. How do we settle our differences through community democracy, compromise, and service in the midst of conflict, extreme behavior, and fear? And of course, in the United States, January 6th and the Capitol insurrection and treasonous activity, in fact, representation of the dark side of condition 4. And the point I simply want to make here is this. For many, many years, many people in the environmental field in North America really focused exclusively on condition 1. Or there were people who were mostly interested in condition 2 or condition 3 or condition 4, whatever it might be. But now we've reached the point where you can't deal with any of them in isolation. All of these are connected. And in fact, that's the whole core of the environmental justice movement, which is the most powerful aspect, I think, of how we're thinking about environmental studies right now, and American studies as well. So these all need to be connected. And that's part of my motivation for writing this book, and so much of the book looks to make these connections. At the same time, and what I'm doing right now essentially is, I'm telling you more about myself, my background, what I think is important, and I'm also, this is a problem statement of sorts, but I'm going to also present to you solutions-based orientations because I think that's crucial. These are additional trends that impact how we think about environmental learning. This is increasingly an urban planet. If you look at any of the demographic numbers, it's pretty extraordinary, the shift from rural to urban over, let's say, from the time of I was born, 1950 till 2000, and between 2000 and 2050. We estimate that 80% of the world's population will be in cities by 2050. Also, the inevitability of cosmopolitan culture. This is a real huge challenge for traditional nation states. And I'll get into this in more detail. We know that the egregious maldistribution of wealth, for the most part, is getting worse as the 14 billionaires stash their money tax-free in various places around the world. And we know that the prevalence, proliferation, if you will, of information networks creates new cognitive orientations in terms of how we perceive nature, how we perceive each other. And I do think that in very challenging political circumstances, we need to somehow maintain a balance between openness to diverse points of view and vigilance, because it's easy to it's easy to be exploited. And so there's a real interesting challenge here for all of us. Okay, so those are the trends. So early on in the book, after I make that problem statement and discuss the tides of change, I look at this concept of the Anthropocene because it's discussed so much, and perhaps I reveal some of my 60s orientation by asking the question, is the Anthropocene blowing your mind? And what I mean by that is, how do we deal with this proliferation of electronic media, which gives us some wonderful gifts, like my ability to participate with all of you and engage with you today. Yet on the other hand, it means that we spend far too much of our time in front of screens, and that really dramatically changes how we see the world. By the way, a lot of the artwork in this show is done by my son, Jake Seven, who's a graph artist in Tasmania, Australia. Lord knows when I'll see him again with COVID, hopefully at some point soon. And this is a mural that he painted when he was in the States in Cambridge, Massachusetts, depicting seas rising around the city of Boston. And there'll be some more of his work as we proceed. So here's the first little narrative in this chapter. And I want to say about the book is filled with narrative. It's filled with your old literary studies people, American studies, that's great. I feel you have to tell stories to make the work come alive. And my point in telling personal stories is to empower the reader to tell his or her own, because I think it's through this storytelling that we gain deeper insights into knowing the world. And so that's why I do it. And that's how I teach as well. I always ask, in any class that I teach, I ask students to develop narratives about their relationship to the world, and use those as the basis of theoretical speculation and synthesis. So we always start with the narrative, and the narrative could be a written narrative, but it also could be some artistic representation of one kind or another. Anyway, the narrative that I start with here in this chapter is my screen on the upper left, which you're looking at, and how easy it is to be catapulted into the rabbit hole, if you will, of the screen, so that everything is confined. And if this is a computer screen, you look at your phone, and that's how you're seeing the world. And so I'm looking at it and I'm realizing, my goodness, I've been staring at this for an hour, and it takes me in places that I didn't intend to go. And part of that is the algorithmic challenge of using any social media or using the web that, you know, traces where you've been and makes suggestions about where to go. And it's very hard sometimes to maintain your autonomy under these circumstances. And by the way, this chapter deals with all of these questions. And then I take you to where I'm sitting right now, which is my office, my room, my study. And I realized that every book, every little box, every photograph is a portal of sorts, just like the computer is. And it's a portal into the world of my mind, or the world of other people's minds. And then I look out the window and see it. And gosh, I should show it to you right now. You can see what happens when you look out the window. Oh yes, it's the northern forest filled with the beautiful changing of the foliage and the seasons. And then I decide finally to go outside, and everything changes. My entire world changes. I can breathe again, and I have my full sensory awareness, and I can smell and be there. And this is not just a rural exercise. You can do this absolutely anywhere. So I talk about the extent to which all of us have our cognitive orientations challenged by the amount of time that we spend in front of screens. And then, again, it's a mixed bag. I'm not a Luddite, but it's important for us to monitor all of this. And when I think about the Anthropocene, typically the language is used to suggest that the process of globalization has resulted in natural resource extraction that's so intense that it rivals a geological age. And that's the reason for naming this the Anthropocene. But I see it as two mutually conducive trends: the global extraction of natural resources and the intensity of electronic connectivity. And because you can't really have one without the other. And then what results is a dynamic perceptual reconditioning of human perceptual awareness. And so the challenge for us as educators, as thinkers, as scholars, as citizens, is how do we reclaim autonomy in a time of global transformation? And I think that this is a question that's on everyone's mind, but it's not always fully articulated. And this could become a time of human awakening to all of these challenges as well. And that's how we have to look at it. This is another, I love this. This is another one of Jake's paintings. I love the idea of the Anthropocene viewing itself, through these eyes. So one of the things that I suggest in this chapter is something called the deliberate pause, where you find ways during the course of your day to extract yourself from the busyness of the screen. And there are a lot of suggestions in the book for how you might do something like this, so you can reconnect with other people, with the natural world. And it's not hard to do. It's just a matter of taking a few moments and looking at the sky and looking at some trees and reoriented yourself, recalibrating, because you all know it's very easy to get caught up in the world of screens. Okay, so that sets I ask many questions in that chapter about this notion of autonomy and how we take control of the decisions that we make. And I think these are very, very important questions for all educators. Well, I want to look now at the body of what I want to talk about today, and that is the relationship between ecological social networks, the challenge of migration and its relationship to climate change and political change, and then finally the relationship between local and global, because that's so crucial to how we think about all these questions. This is a photograph that I took a couple of years ago in Utah, which is in the American West, in the Mountain West. And this is the so-called Golden Spike. This is supposedly, of course, it's been redone. This is supposedly the railroad tie that connected East and West in 1867. And I'm fascinated by this because what this meant, by the way, the construction of the American Transcontinental Railroad was actually a mess. It was filled with fraud, filled with corruption. It used forced immigrant labor. It devastated native lands. It was really a mess in many respects. You don't learn that part of the history, but if you really want to study American history, then you probably want to look at this event because it is such a symbol for so much of what American history is all about in its positive and negative aspects. At any rate, I'm interested in it because this meant that the entire country was just about connected. East and West was connected. And it was connected in such a way that goods could move very quickly back and forth. So this changes everything. No longer do you have to ship things all the way around South America to get from Eastern North America to Western North America. You can ship them across the country on a rail bed. And it only took several decades before this network was entirely complete. And the other thing that's really interesting about this is psychologically, it changes the way we even think about networks and connectivity. And I'm going to get into that in a moment. So there's so much, and think about the year 1867. I mean, that's just several years after the American Civil War, which the American country, we are still recovering from and trying to sort out, by the way, all these years later, but that's for another discussion. And also, our Origins of Species by Charles Darwin was completed in the early 1860s. So this is a very interesting time in American and global history, is the mid-19th century, for a variety of different reasons. But I want to look at the concept of networks. And for me, it was my visit to the Golden Spike that inspired me to look more deeply into the concept of networks more generally. So I want to start by looking, one of the important themes in this book is that you always start with the biosphere. You always start with looking at ecological relationships. And then you look at social and political relationships, and you see the way that these things are connected. One doesn't cause the other, by the way. It's much more complex than that. But there are templates in the biosphere for how the world works that it's very important for us to understand. And one of those templates is the template of networks. So here are some examples. If you look at tree roots on the upper right, if you look at mycelium on the bottom right, if you look at dendritic drainage patterns, these are all really beautiful network templates that are fascinating to think about. The mycelium in particular are of great interest because we're learning now, as I look outside at the forest, it's connected by this incredible, complex, intricate, and very beautiful network of mycelium that allow various species of trees to communicate with each other. And we know hardly anything about mycelium. In fact, if you count the number of lawyers and bankers, let's say, in the world to the number of mycelium scientists, I mean, you can't even scale something like that. Yet arguably, some of the most important learning that we need as a species is to understand mycelium and the connectivity. The great mushroom visionary Paul Stamets describes mycelium as the original internet, and I think he's right. But you also look at these networks. You have galactic network. These are stylized diagrams, of course. You have neural networks, and look at the similarities between them. They're really interesting. There's a lot to learn by looking. These are different mycelial networks, obviously magnified. Above ground and underground roots, which are connected to mycelium, and of course the branches in the trees, which form network patterns of their own. Highly stylized ecological diagrams that look at the relationships on the left between different species and networks. I can't emphasize enough how important it is for us to understand the networks in our lives. And more, again, looking at the density of relationships. And the interesting thing about networks and ecological systems, which, by the way, is one of the most important growing research directions of ecological theory, is that networks exist both in space and in time. Now, these are spatial relationships that we're looking at on these diagrams, but there are also temporal relationships in networks. There are certain times, for example, during the day or during the week or during the season when certain networks light up, if you will. And then the diagram on the right shows some of the connections in a food web, but I'm going to show you that diagram in 3 different ways during the course of this presentation, because I want you to see the pattern relationship here. And this is a network of seabirds in the Pacific Ocean. We can get into, I'm going to get into this briefly shortly when I look at migration, but the migratory networks are very important to understand as well. And then we look at infrastructure networks. I mean, you could think about wherever you're sitting right now, and you could look out the window if you've got one and think about the ecological networks, but think about the networks in where you live. The plumbing networks, the energy networks, the food networks. These are all really interesting. And my goodness, now with COVID and the challenges to the global supply chain, which by the way, I don't ever think will return to the way they once were, which may be a really good thing for localities. You know, we can talk about that. But here's the United States transmission grid. And this is the network. And this is a very centralized network. So this kind of network, if something goes wrong someplace, it's going to cause trouble for an entire region. And solar systems and wind systems, by the way, would be decentralized networks. So how we think about the distribution of energy and food and healthcare can be very wonderfully informed by how we think about the patterns of networks and which ones make sense and which don't. There's a lot of sociological study that's gone into this. I cover some of the literature, the accessible literature, which basically means literature that I can read, and probably you can too, in my book. There's a lot of bibliographical references in the book, but there are also these other diagrams of what networks look like, and these are various social networks that are interesting to understand. It turns out that most people tend to congregate in what are called homological networks. That is people who think similarly to themselves. And that's part of the reason why we have all these misinformation challenges to deal with because of Facebook or metaverse, whatever the heck you want to call it, or any of the social media. But the really, really creative individuals, so here's some unsolicited career advice for anyone who's interested. The really creative individual understands how to become a node that connects diverse networks. And that's how good organizations work, and that's how successful practitioners work, is that you are capable of relating to people in homological networks. I can't emphasize enough how much I think this stuff needs to be taught in schools, K through 12, and then in universities, and it's not. We have a whole generation of folks, and then older folks like me, who are completely enmeshed in these networks, and they never receive any instruction in how they work and how you cultivate them and how you protect yourself from misinformation. And this to me is crucial for environmental learning, for American studies, for anything that we study. Just have some fun and Google social networks in Google Images, which by the way is a great research tool. I love to do this, and I make slideshows often by putting a concept in Google Images and seeing what shows up. And here are a whole bunch of diagrams of social networks, which we can't possibly get into in any detail now. But one of the things that I do when I do consultations for colleges or universities or any organizations, and I did many of them before COVID, is I ask folks to as a way to understand how their organizations work, is to develop diagrams of the social networks of the organization. And you can do this for yourself, by the way. You can do this at home. You create a diagram of your social network and ask yourself the question, am I connected to the people I want to be connected to? Or how do I break out of this group of connections? And where do I stand? And how do I want to change? And it's a great thing for organizations to look at as well, because often when organizations do something like this, they realize that their reach, their breadth is not as great as they would like it to be. Or maybe they're spread too thin. So these are interesting things to do. So the point again, as I move on to the next concept, is I want to show that there's the template of ecological networks and social networks. There's a lot we can learn by studying those. There's a lot we can learn about how to live a better life, how to have more efficient systems and more efficient governments, and how to have more efficient organizations. And networks lead to migration, because migration is a series of networks as well. And this is, to me, the most stressful, impactful challenge of our times and the next several decades. And you are on the front lines. Everyone is, actually. I mean, certainly the United States is, but Turkey is obviously on the front lines. You know way more about this than I do, so I don't want to sound misinformed, other than to say that because of your geographical location and your proximity in between the Balkans and Europe in general, and of course, Africa and the Middle East, Turkey is at a crossroads, and always has been. And that's one of the things, as an outsider, that makes Turkey such a fascinating country for me, because it is a crossroads nation in many respects. So this challenge of migration is really crucial. And before I move on to the next slide, I want to say that depending on what demographic source you look at, the number of migrants in the world is somewhere between 1 in 8 and 1 in 12, which means that approximately 10% of the world's population is on the move. And that doesn't count people within countries. I'll get to that again in a moment. I found this fascinating, world migration since 1500. And you can look at the spread of different places that people move to. And of course, the great hypocrisy for you American studies people of the North American continent is that it required, for the most part, the decimation of native populations to make it work. And now the idea that we want to keep other people out, to me, is the ultimate hypocrisy. And I think that's true anywhere in the world for the most part. We have to learn how to make borders more porous in such a way that it can create some stability, but also understand that people are going to be forced to move more than ever. There was a whole essay in The Economist that I read this morning about the networks in Africa and how so many people are moving between countries in Africa because they can't get to Europe for one reason or other, or it's too expensive. But this is part of migratory networks is just is a biosphere phenomenon, and it's certainly a human phenomenon. And you can see here that it didn't take very long. It took about 20, 30,000 years for the entire world to get settled, maybe 50,000 years. And it's interesting to see how modern North and South America are in terms of human population. But we have all these networks, and then we have all these walls. So we have, well, you've got your own walls there in Turkey. And are these walls legitimate or not? I don't know. I don't think so. I think there are better ways of doing things. And a wall it's a temporary construction that it may seem like it's keeping things out, but it's not really. And here you have a portrait of some walls. The upper right is a wall at the border of Hungary. Upper left is the American wall that separates the United States and Mexico. And then the Great Wall of China, and then a wall that's in Kuwait. These walls, the Mexican wall, the wall between the United States and Mexico, disrupts everything. Ranchers don't like it. Anyone who works the land doesn't like it. It creates more disruptions than anything else, in my view. And that's not to say that you don't need to have really, really sound immigration policies and standards, but there's a lot to be studied in terms of borders and boundaries and the relationship between ecological boundaries and political boundaries. I'll get to that briefly in a moment as well. I'm not going to go into this diagram in too much depth, other than to suggest that there are a lot of resources if you're interested in all of this. Internal displacements are as important as external displacements. When we look at migration, there are reasons why people move from one place to another. And often it's because of a political challenge or an environmental challenge. And sometimes it's because it's a way to promote economic opportunity. But displacement means that someone is forced to move from where they once resided to some other place. And this is the global challenge, as I see it, that connects all of the tides of change in one place. It is the front lines. I would love to see so many more programs in undergraduate and graduate education that look together at migration, climate, and public health. That, to me, is so important. And institutions that put programs like that together will be very successful and will be doing a great public service. Here's the second diagram in the sequence of these circles that are connected. And this depicts the bilateral flows between 196 countries between mid-2005 and mid-2010. And probably if you took another snapshot of this between 2015 and 2020, it would change quite a bit. This is a good diagram to show America-centric folks who think that the only migration is between America and other places. Well, of course, that's silly. And countries all over the world are exchanging peoples for one reason or another all of the time. That's part of the globalization process, which of course has been made more challenging in recent years. And the point I want to make here is simply that everything moves on this planet all the time. Continents move. So here's a portrait of the first breaking apart, splitting apart of Gondwana 250 million years ago. And you can see and trace it. And think about all the species that are displaced in situations like this. So in order to survive, species have to have a certain level of adaptive flexibility to move from one place to another. And that's always been the case. It's a biosphere phenomenon that species, for the most part, move from one place to another in order to survive. And you can look at whales, for example, that have summer feeding areas and winter breeding areas. Are you going to put a wall in the ocean so they can't go between those places? Or you can look at, in the United States, you can look at birds and amphibians from north to south during spring and fall. It's massive. This, by the way, comes from a website where this is animated, so you can see the dynamic metabolism of all of these movements. On the right, my right, you have monarch butterfly migration, which is a fascinating process because it takes place over multiple generations. And on the left, you can see the projected change in biogeography as a result of climate and how the forest itself will move. I mean, the forest moves after the ice retreats. Everything's moving all the time, except with plants, animals are the seed carriers, but they move as well. They just use agents, animals as agents of change, vectors of transmission. This is the slave trade. And you can see how pronounced this is. We're still trying to understand and uncover the dimensions of the catastrophe of the slave trade. And this is a portrait, because you're American studies, I thought you'd want to see this, of the African-American migration. The first great migration between 1910 and 1940, and then the second great migration between 1940 and 1970. And you can see the movements in these diagrams. Again, each of these slides, by the way, is a universe in itself. There's so much to think about and so much to study here. And I'm giving you the forced march approach to all of this material. This is a fascinating map as well, and I think all Americans should see this because it shows the ancestry, American ancestry, and its percentage in various places. And all of these people for the most part, came from some other place. Displacements occur have always occurred historically during the history of human life on the planet, but they are more pronounced during the Anthropocene. And this is a wildfire in Australia, which have had devastating impacts on people and climate. This is after the flooding that takes place after hurricanes in Central America. This has also been a huge, huge problem, huge challenge. And this is only going to get worse with climate change. These are wildfires in North America, in California, actually. So you can see that it says climate change will force a new American migration, which takes place. Here's the migration that took place after Katrina. Where did people go to when they have to leave New Orleans? And where did they go and why did they go there? These are the really important questions of our times, and any scholarship that pays attention to it is doing the world a huge service. There'll be 10 major migration routes over the next several decades. And I won't go over all of them right now, but it's important to understand and trace these. And this is just a screenshot I took of various curricular and educational activities that teach about these questions. I think you can learn so much about a community and about a nation by asking the question, how does it treat newcomers? And there are a lot of good things that take place as well. There are all these wonderful organizations, globally speaking, that are trying to help people understand how to bring newcomers into their community and do it in a way that integrates them well and doesn't displace people who already live in those communities. And there's a lot of good stuff that you can do here. And there are good Americans too who want to welcome refugees. And this is a demonstration in Washington that makes this point. And even in my small city of Keene, New Hampshire, of 20,000, there is a group that is working on human rights for refugees. So this is really important. And I think it's necessary to constantly point out the good things that are happening on the planet. And there are many. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment as well. If you want to read more about migration, and I encourage you to do so, if you want to read more about American migration, specifically the African-American migration, Isabel Wilkerson's book is excellent. But Sonia Shaw's book is just fantastic. It's The Next Great Migration. And she covers this in ways that I think are very ecological and cultural and political. And she uncovers quite a bit in this fantastic book. And there are all these UN agencies that are dealing with this issue as well. So let me move on to what I mean by cosmopolitan bioregionalism, which seems like a contradiction in terms, but it's a term, but I like that. I like terms that force you to think about what they mean and why are they juxtaposed and what synthesis do they represent, or what discontinuity do they represent. And I wrote an essay called Cosmopolitan Bioregionalism many years ago in some bioregional anthology. And I decided to look at that concept again. And what I mean by that is that the idea of bioregionalism, which I'll discuss briefly in a moment, is that we really focus on local place, but how do we do so in a way that we also integrate multiple cultures and multiple generations of cultures? But we have to start at the beginning and suggest that really, if we understand place, we have to understand what communities lived in a place before we did and what happened to them and where are they now. And if that's something that's of interest to you, then I highly recommend the website Landmark, which is the global platform of indigenous and community lands. It's really worthwhile to spend some time looking at this, because you can see how much the world has changed over the last 500 years of European and Asian expansion. So you start, if we're thinking about bioregions and we're thinking about place, you start with the culture that preceded you or the cultures that preceded you and get a sense. This is the true cosmopolitan vision of multiple cultures with different language groups and different ecologies sharing the planet in ways that make sense. And how do you accomplish that? And it can be done. You know, we mostly hear examples of what goes wrong, but there are examples of what goes right. So for example, Haida Gwaii, which the colonial name for was the Queen Charlotte Islands, are these beautiful islands off the coast of British Columbia and Alaska and the northwestern United States and Canada. And they are a sovereign nation that has joint sovereignty with Canada. And there's a wonderful book on the Haida Gwaii by Mark Dowie that points out how this got accomplished. And it's a real template for other native populations and the nation states. And this is, as you know, I mean, you have it in your country, of course, you know, in Eastern Turkey on the border with Syria. But this is a huge issue and we have to solve this one. I mean, arguably, this is the most important global challenge, that we will not solve any of the environmental challenges unless we figure out a way to deal with all of these different nationalities and what their rights are and how we coexist with them. And I think it can be done, although it's very difficult. I did some work with the Centerpole project in South Dakota, in Montana. I'll say more about that in a moment. But there are other examples. Southeast. This is on the coast of Alaska. This is a partnership between conservation organizations and Native peoples, and it's working really well. In fact, they just got a $5 million grant from the Nature Conservancy, which was matched by a grant from a Native corporation called Sea Alaska. And I bring these things out to show that this is a vision of cosmopolitan bioregionalism, where you have people from all different cultures working together to make change in a way that's sustainable and efficient. I love this map of North America, and it's very complicated. But the reason why I'm showing it to you is because this is the original North America, if you will. And you think about look at all the colors. It's a beautiful map as well. You look at all the colors on the map, and you look at the chart on the left. Those are all the different physiographic regions there are maybe, I mean, over 100 at least distinct biogeographies in North America. And you can look at a map of almost anywhere in the world and you can find these distinct biogeographies. And the amazing thing is that they all have today their own dialects of English. And before that, there were all these other language groups. And if you were to look at this map, oops, can I go back to it? What happened? Okay. I just went too fast for myself. I wanted to show you, oh, I know what's happening. I wanted to show you this, and just hold this in your mind's eye for a moment, and then look at this. And what you can see is that there's a correspondence between the physiographic region and the language. So you had all these different language groups in North America prior to European colonization. And this was a cosmopolitan North America. The more we study this, the more archaeological evidence, the more we know that there was a very sophisticated trade network that didn't take place as quickly as the Transcontinental Railroad allowed it to. And for the most part, East and West was separated by the Rocky Mountains. But the North-South trade was substantial. And think about the fact, too, that each of these native languages, and I don't want to romanticize any of this, but each of these native languages also had very specific languages to discuss the natural world. And so there was tremendous knowledge in what these indigenous cultures, ecological knowledge, brought to bear in terms of their perceptual abilities. And there are all these neat maps about what a cosmopolitan North America would look like, and what if we broke it down that way, a bioregional North America, because clearly the way things work right now is just, it's entirely broken. You have a senator from West Virginia who clogs up the works. You can't get anything done because of one senator from a coal state in the middle of the country, and then another one from Arizona who's a total narcissist as far as I can tell, as is this guy from West Virginia. These two people make it impossible to get anything done. It's really, really broken. So part of the reason why it's broken is because there's what unifies different parts of this country. I'm at a loss to figure that out. So, we'll see where that all goes. But there's something very beautiful about a cosmopolitan culture. It's just wonderful to see all the varieties of types of people there are on this planet and how much we learn from them. And you think about your own life and when it's been most enriched. And typically it's most enriched when you're in a place that's biodiverse and that's culturally diverse. The world is filled with these heroes from all over the world who are making a difference. And we need to be solutions-based. And that's what I want to look at right now for a moment. If you follow the mainstream media in North America, it's easy to be consistently depressed because even the liberal and left-leaning publications like the Washington Post and the Times and the Guardian all focus for the most part on fear and all the things that are going wrong. And they never really discuss great projects and programs around the world and around North America that are making a difference. And there are many of them. There really are many of them. And I think it's important in all of our work that we point this out. If there are solutions-based, think about in your own community and think about the work that you do. If anything else, if I can leave you with any message, it's that I think your work as a scholar is to do anything you can to promote solutions-based orientations to all of these issues. I'm not going to talk about that slide right now. And part of the where this takes place is in cities. There's a book in the middle called Ecological Urbanism that it's like a whole earth catalog of the 21st century. It's filled with hundreds and hundreds of global solutions that come out of local city initiatives. And you can find these everywhere. They're fascinating to look at. There are all these blogs that you can check out. I think I have a slide that depicts them. I hope I do, we'll see. And it can be so beautiful. I mean, imagine what's possible in cities with great art like Hundertwasser's art. And you see some of this in places around the world. I guess I don't have that slide right here. But so there are blogs you can check out. There's a blog called The Next City, which is filled with solutions-based orientations. There's a blog called The Nature of Cities. There's a blog called Daily Yonder, which is, if anyone's interested, send me a note and I can send you the links to all of this. which is rural based for North America. So there are all these networks of solutions-based folks and communities that are making change. And we have to focus on those to give balance to our psyches. I'm going to conclude with the final chapters of the book, which really are about learning and the process of learning. And my view is that in a world of constant cultural, political, and environmental change, we need to strive for improvisational excellence. And what I mean by that is how do we think on our feet and how we adapt to a world of changing circumstances. Some of the great passions of my life have been music. I play music, guitar and keyboards, sports. I used to, when I was younger, well, up until my 60s, I played a lot of hoops, basketball, and games, playing games, and observing nature. And what connects all of these things is the improvisational flow that makes me so happy when I'm in that flow state. And I think it's in those flow states, as educators, even as writers, there are times when you get into a flow state and ideas move through you in ways that you never figured out that you had inside. It's really pretty amazing. And so as educators, I think our goal is to allow people to enter these flow states, and there are many ways to do it. Through art, through play, through games, through sports, or through dance, or wherever it might be. But also, that's how you understand global environmental change, because global environmental change is filled with patterns. And those patterns are always different, depending, if you look at the sky and you look at cloud formations, the patterns are always different. But to really understand the weather, you have to be able to interpret those patterns and see where they may lead, even though they're always different. The world is filled with these pattern changes. In my book, Bring the Biosphere Home, as Ufuk knows, that so much of that book is learning how to perceive these patterns of global environmental change. You see it all around you, wherever you may be. There are thought systems that are focused on change, environmental change. To me, the I Ching, the remarkable Chinese oracular system of wisdom that has contributions from Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist and Western traditions, essentially is oriented around nature archetypes. And it's the combination of those nature archetypes that leads to wisdom, human wisdom. I postulate in my own book, what would it be if we had an environmental change I Ching? And then finally, the book ends with a section on what I call perceptual reciprocity. You know, I just taught a 6-week class for a university that was, and I did it as a volunteer. All the money went for scholarships. There were about 20 students in it. And we talked about this last night. And the idea of perceptual reciprocity, in my view, is that everything on this planet perceives. Other species, of course, perceive, habitats perceive, maybe the entire planet perceives. That doesn't mean that everything is sentient. But part of our challenge as educators is how we tap into those alternative perceptual realities, because they make so much sense. So it's one of my son's paintings of an owl. And I think this is a perfect painting to depict this notion. Again, once again, the bias, what are we? But as human creatures, or as animal creatures, the biosphere gazing down upon itself or across it itself. This is the third in the sequence of those diagrams. And I share with you, not because I'm an advocate of drug use, but this comes from an article by a neurophysiologist who's looking at the difference between brain synapses under psilocybin. And the one on the right is under psilocybin. And the whole idea, of course, is that everything opens up, and that can be overwhelming. I'm not suggesting it, but I do think when we attain improvisational flow states, when we attain levels of perceptual reciprocity, which is really, really hard to do. But when we attain those states, we're open to learning, and we're open to adaptability, and we're open to change. And so as educators, our challenge is how do we make those states more possible? And there are a lot of ways to do it. It could be through art, it could be through meditation, it could be through simply spending time outdoors. But it's being able to open ourselves up to multiple perspectives and multiple possibilities that we truly learn. This could be one final set of conclusion comments, but I guess this is the introduction to the conclusion. What I want to suggest here again is there are incredible people all over the world doing wonderful things. And this is my portrait of some of them. This is the Center Pole Project on the right, and where they're doing all kinds of work, getting Native kids to attend college, having them understand indigenous practices of land use and food. On the upper left is a program called Garden City Harvest in Missoula, Montana, that uses food and gardens as a way of doing elder care, as a way of doing social work. On the bottom left is the Cully neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, which is the poorest section of Portland. They're doing all kinds of things with ecological restoration. I profiled a bunch of these projects in the Pacific Northwest of the United States in a PDF, which is free. I can send it to you if you want the link. And I just chose 8 projects to profile, but I could have chosen several hundred. And that was just one section of America. You can be almost anywhere and throw a rock and you'll find a project or a program that's doing really good work. And so that's the point I want to make. And finally, a lot of the book is about teaching and learning. And the second chapter in the book, which I'm talking about here at the very end of this presentation, looks at memory and how much I focus on memory as a vehicle of learning for folks. And I try to adaptive learning, which I just discussed in terms of improvisational excellence and perceptual reciprocity. And there it's how do we find a path through the changing flows and circumstances of our social and technological encounters, or through the patterns of global environmental change. And there's also perennial learning, which is awareness of the wisdom of the ages. And I think our challenge is how do we integrate the two? So the I Ching, or depending on your own philosophical tradition, there are great works that are awareness of wisdom of the ages, but we can't stick with those works alone. They're not enough. There needs to be adaptive learning mixed in with it. And I love the notion of posterity that comes from the great poet Gary Snyder, where he describes this present moment that lives on to become long ago. And I think that's the spirit we need as we move through the world. I think it's useful to go back and look at childhood memories and look at the things that inspire you. And for me, it was this book, Harold and the Purple Crayon. I was 5 years old and I was reading at an early age, and I had this book, and Harold falls asleep and dreams, and he begins to draw where he goes. And that was my first lesson in improvisational excellence, because he gets worried at one point that he can't find his home, so he draws all these apartment buildings, and then he realizes that there was a half moon outside his window, and if he can draw the half moon, he can find his place. This is my first lesson in retrospective of place-based learning and improvisational learning. And also things that inspired you to wonder. In fact, the next book I'm going to write about will be an educational memoir of moments of wonder that just come from ordinary experiences, from childhood to being an elderly man. These guides, these golden guides, my parents took me to the Hayden Planetarium when I was a very young boy, and gosh, it just opened my mind to so many things. But there were also toxic memories. When I was a young boy, we had the fog man who'd come through our neighborhood, and they were spraying DDT on suburban Long Island where I grew up. And this was toxicity, and I've dealt with the ramifications of this in my body at several points over the years. And the interesting thing is, I talked about this with a group of graduate students at New York University from all over the world, and everyone has, and again, as I'm describing this, you can think about it yourself. Everyone has these moments of inspiration and these moments of toxicity in their lives. And it's very helpful and useful to remember them and what they meant for us and how we learn from them and what we take from them. So the book is filled with what I call environmental learning templates. This is a list of them. I'm not going to go over them now, but it's filled with mapping activities and narrative activities and all sorts of things that you can do in teaching situations, or you can do on your own. And I'm fascinated by the tapestries of art that we develop when we think about these kinds of things. So I think that is enough. I am exhausted. Hopefully you're not, and we have time for a bunch of questions, but check out my website when you get a chance. It's just myname.com. and it refers you to other books, to things I'm doing, and it's a way for you to contact me, and that's what I love to do. So reach out. I'm happy to chat with you by Zoom or just answer any questions you might have. I feel that's my role in the world right now, is to be as supportive and nourishing as possible with the people I'm in touch with. So there you go.
Thank you so much, Professor Tomashow. And thank you for saying you're writing a new book, which will give us another chance to invite you. Well, I would like to read a paragraph from this wonderful book. I'm really thinking that the book is so important for opening our eyes to our environments, especially this last concept you introduced, perceptual reciprocity. I'm so interested in this concept. So here I go. This is from To Know the World. For decades, this has been the overwhelming challenge of environmental learning: to expand awareness of the natural world from a deeper communion, and in so doing, build respect, gratitude, and appreciation for the conditions of our human existence on a magnificent planet. Here is the rub. Amid all the distractions, traps, and frailties of the human experience, that level of awareness and gratitude is exceptionally difficult to achieve. But without it, environmental learning lacks soul and passion, and it will never be more than an intellectual accomplishment. I just love these words, and I wanted to share your words with our audience today. I'm sure there are questions, and so the floor is open for your questions. You can write in the chat box, or you may just open your microphone and talk to Professor Tomashow.
Okay, so we have one from Alan Pekanek. I hope I said that correctly.
Actually, Aiden, you can ask yourself as long as you're here.
Yeah, maybe you can just turn on your microphone, Aylin.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be great.
Good morning, Professor Tomashow. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to read with us and for your incredible book. I loved it. Your ideas of taking a more like physical, go out into the world and explore it kind of approach to environmental learning. It was very important, especially in Turkey as well. I have two questions for you. I will try not to take too much of your time. So in your book, you state that, and in this presentation, you state that environmental learning includes service and action and going out and being physically helping your community. And I 100% agree with this. But I believe personally, and also for a lot of young people, this is juxtaposed with this personal experience of witnessing the world being polluted beyond our control. Much like in any other types of activism in this field as well, it's kind of hard to reconcile the need to be an activist and serving the community, and also witnessing these powers wrecking our world on a daily basis. We are onslaughted with these images. You mentioned you are against this doom and gloom and incapacity types of ideologies, and you want a more solution-based approach. And I was very moved by that when I was reading your book. But like I said, this onslaught of despair and fear mongering can become a bit too much and filter out anything else, anything solution-based. So I was wondering if you have any kind of suggestions for correcting this mindset at a more personal, like emotional level, on top of all of those resources that you mentioned. In our minds, how can we correct this idea when we go out into the world and seeing the beauty of it and not just the fear-mongering aspects? Thank you.
That's a great question, and it was very eloquently and clearly stated. Thank you. And thank you too for reading the book. I don't want to, I sound like an old fogey, but we've been dealing with this question since the 60s. I mean, it's not new. And any environmental group that you're with, or any activist group, is going to have times when they are subject to their own victimization. We all do this. But if you look at the great leaders of change throughout world history, they're persistent. They do it one step at a time. They understand that they can't always see the direct manifestations of their actions, but sometimes you can. The change takes place over many lifetimes. And to think that you're going to be able to change things just because of your actions is gratuitous. It's just things don't work that way. So the first thing I have to say is that, I mean, you can go back. Moses Maimonides, the great Jewish theologian and scholar from the medieval ages, talked about how the world is always on a fulcrum between good and evil. And every action that you take that's a good action swings that fulcrum back. And I think that's beautiful advice, actually. You know, you never, by the way, I address this in great detail in Bring the Biosphere Home. There's a chapter called Keeping Global Change in Mind that deals with all of these issues in some depth. You really never can know the full impact of your actions, but you have to have faith enough in your own agency to know that there might be some way. Look, I just wrote this book. And I don't get a lot of response, honestly. I mean, I give presentations and that's great and things happen, but I have no idea really who's reading it and what the impact is other than, anything. And it can get pretty depressing, to tell you the truth, because you put so many hours into it. But somewhere along the way, I know, well, someone's reading this and they're passing it on and it's inspiring them to action. It's not that I want to sell lots of books, it's that I want to inspire action. But you never know at what the result of your action is going to be. So it's really important not to fall into the victimizations. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that I think if you think you're going to change all of this, you're not going to. But there will be refugia around the world. And I mean refugia in the sense of the Ice Age, that there are going to be communities that have resilient and sustainable practices that are going to make it through some of these awful changes that are taking place. And that's what we need to be focusing on. The exemplary communities that are coming up with ecological, cultural, and political practices that work and that may influence others, and to really focus as much as we can. That's why I like the solutions base, because you can get something accomplished sometimes on the right scale, so that if you're always focusing on the global scale, you're going to be overwhelmingly depressed. You're just going to be. It's so hard not to. But if you're focused on what's possible, to what is the scale of your activity and how is that going to work, then I think it's better. Finally, obviously, we've all been thinking about this for a long time. I think you have to balance grief with celebration. If you're constantly grieving, you're not going to go anywhere. And if you're constantly celebrating, then there's something wrong with you too, right? There has to be a combination of both. By the way, Kathy Dean Moore's new book, Earth's Wild Music, does really a great job at this. I mean, she can get about as depressed as anyone on this planet, but she also is a person who's really capable of celebration, and she gets into this in this book, which I've really enjoyed. No, I'm biased because I know Kathy, but you can check that out. Anyway, look, you know what? How do you say your name? Island? Yeah. There are no good answers to your question. There just aren't any. But there are practices that matter. And everyone has to find the practice that matches their temperament. And that's where guidance comes in. So thank you for the question. And thanks for being patient with my inability to answer it.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a beautiful answer. Thank you so much. I would like to ask my second question, if you do not mind.
Again, I have all the time. It's fine. I'm here for you all.
Thank you so much. So in the ecological knowledge gap section of your book, you mentioned this gap between academically trained scientists and the public who have practical experience and local knowledge. So this reminded me of similar issue with many other marginalized groups, for example, the LGBT community. And in these groups, this gap doesn't just create a simple difference, but significant miscommunication, sometimes even aggression between the two, which is something that I've personally witnessed, where the theorists with high concepts and maybe inaccessible language and the public with lived experience, they have completely different goals in mind. So I was wondering, in your field studies and works with these groups, have you come across something like this? Is this something that exists in environmental groups as well? And if that is the case, what can be done to bridge this gap? For example, in your book, you suggest a new generation of interdisciplinary scholars can be used to bridge this gap. But what would be the specific methods in terms of successfully bringing these two separate sections that already exist and allow them to use their expertise together to do something better and new?
Yeah, another really great question, and thanks for carefully reading the book. I really appreciate that. There are two aspects to the question. What I mean by the ecological knowledge gap is that we have a small elite cadre of environmental scholars who really have some good answers to solve problems of climate and biodiversity, and we know what can be done. But it's very hard to translate that even onto the level of environmental practitioners for a whole variety of reasons. And so some of my suggestions for that, how that happens, is a graphic illustration, the use of art. I write a lot about that and bring the biosphere home, how we need to help us understand scale. So often there can be scientific language that discusses a very complicated environmental change concept, and you can see a piece of art that gets you there too. So I think multiple approaches to learning is what works in that regard. But then the other question is, I think, even more profound in a way, and that is, and we see it right now in America, where people talk about, let's say, the Democrats, who are much more educated than most Republicans, and there's this gap and everything else. And I think well, two things. First, I think that polarization is it's in the interest of the ultra wealthy to constantly talk about polarization, because it takes attention away from what they're doing. So the more, and this is historically true. I mean, throughout, if you can get groups of people to fight each other, then you take away attention from the fact that it's your egregious billionaire stashes of tax-free money that is what's making it difficult for us to pass Biden's legislation. That's what the irony, the contradictions of all of that. So I think polarization, I honestly feel it's overrated. I really do. I think I can have conversations with people who have very different points of view than I, and I can find common ground with those people. You just need time to make it work. You need trust to make it work. Trust is the key to everything in life. It's the key to good organizations. It's the key to good higher education. And from my own basketball playing, it's the key to playing basketball well. It's the key to everything, is to build collaborative trust. And all all of the media discussing polarization makes it even harder to do that kind of thing. Now, there are some people who you can never talk to and never work with because they're just out of their minds. And it's ridiculous to pay attention to them. But there are people who you can come to common ground with. And that's what we need to do. And the projects that I profile in Pacific Northwest Changemakers, I was in projects all over the Pacific Northwest that work with different groups of people. The community of Walla Walla, Washington, has folks from the Hispanic community, from the white community, working together, Republicans and Democrats, because they all care about their city. And it's at the level of the city or level of the town that you can put a lot of this stuff aside and you can find ways of working together. So that's how I see it happening, really. But it means building trust, and building trust takes time. And you can't build trust through a digital poll.
Thank you so much for your answer. Once again, thank you for taking the time to be with us. Those were great answers. And once again, thank you for your book. It really opened my eyes in a lot of different ways. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And write to me anytime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think Onur is raising his hand.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Professor, for this wonderful talk. And I would like to comment on some of my own reflections when I read the book, and I love the book. You stated in the book that as climate change and dispossession and this growing immigrant crisis are very much interconnected. For example, what happened in Afghanistan last summer, the recent Taliban takeover in Afghanistan proves this. It is, for example, reported that Taliban actually exploited the climate crisis by manipulating farmers and farm workers, which make up sort of most of the male working force, who could not have a good crop because of this severe drought and water shortages. So Taliban used the climate change and the crisis to gain support among locals and add new soldiers to its ranks. But and this is a continual pattern that we see in the Middle East, when people, especially farmers, go hungry, radicals are immediately there to manipulate people. Also, the climate change is not indirectly, but directly the source of problems like human rights abuses and underage marriages. Many of the farmers reportedly sold their daughters as child brides, for example, to men to counter poverty stemming from a cropless season and environmental change. As opposed to that, people who hated Taliban and who had no farms to go back to became refugees themselves, and it was a great human tragedy that we all witnessed on the TV. But it seems, however, that populism and this post-truth politics are also methods used also in the United States and in Turkey as well, to sort of trivialize climate change. I remember also reading in your book, that how low screen coverage the environmental issues get on television and mass media. People are sort of desensitized into thinking, well, there is a climate crisis, but we have a lot more urgent matters to solve before we get to that one, which is obviously a false consciousness. So my question would be, yes, we need drastic changes in educating people and children at an early age to raise them with environmental consciousness, but there seems to be big cultural and geographical barriers and paradigms that sort of make implementation of policies on education really hard. So how can these barriers be overcome, and how does one deal with this trivialization that one is sort of constantly subjected to in mass media, in television and social network? Yeah.
Well, that's also an eloquently stated problem statement. I mean, everything that all those patterns and themes that you refer to are extremely challenging. Similar to the previous question, there's no good answer to that other than what you choose to do on your scale. I mean, if you think about the entire global pattern, it's very hard to it's very hard to know how to answer you. However, think about this. I'm just speaking about North America now. In the year 2000, I don't know that there were more than a handful of sustainability coordinators in American colleges and universities. Maybe there were 5 or 10. There certainly weren't any in cities. There weren't any at multinational corporations. By 2020, now we have, oh gosh, just about every college and university in North America has a sustainability manager, or well over, half or 2/3 of them do. Almost every city in North America has a sustainability department that works in the mayor's office. Dozens and dozens and dozens of multinational corporations have sustainability managers and are thinking very carefully about their supply chain, greenwashing notwithstanding. So in the course of 20 years, the sustainability movement has really taken hold. Has it done as much as needs to be done? Well, of course not. But it certainly has influenced President Joe Biden. I mean, some of the things, whether he's able to, actively implement any of these things, he certainly gets it. He's surrounded by people who understand it. I mean, it's pretty remarkable, really, how much has happened in that regard. So once again, you just have to look at the fact that that's change, and that's a lot of change. And in 2000, no one would have thought it would be possible for city governments, multinational corporations, and colleges and universities. Bill McKibben, who's a good friend, has a terrific article in a recent New York Times about the impact of disinvestment. In fact, he refers to Unity College in the article, which I was very pleased to see, because Unity College, as small as we were the first college in the country to disinvest. It was easy to do because our endowment was so small. But then it became a whole movement. It became a national movement. And you have the major universities all over North America. And in fact, you have in many institutions that are disinvesting of oil stocks. So these are good things. And, we have to point to them as well.
Thank you so much. And there's a growing aggressive activism in the world as well, which makes us think that the change, there is change and there is an aggressive push towards it. Like when you, for example, see the news that the revival of, for example, the Friday for Future in Germany and Greta Thunberg and her comments, and people taking this very seriously in recent German elections. A lot of the young activists actually went into hunger strikes, and they tried to convince the parties to implement policies that would reduce CO2 reduction. So there is that optimism. But again, politics seems to be sort of enforcing layerism and trivialization that makes things really hard.
Yeah, true. But okay, here's another thing, which buttresses both of your seemingly contradictory points, even though I see how they're connected. Media coverage in the States of the January 6th insurrection, compare the coverage of that. How many people were involved in that? 500, maybe 1,000. Compare media coverage of that to media coverage of the several million people who demonstrated on behalf of climate justice, right? They get maybe a day of coverage, even in The Guardian. And the January 6th folks, how much coverage do they get? Tons and tons and tons of coverage. So, again, that both buttresses your point. There's a trivialization of the several million activists, many of whom are youth activists on climate, and a hype of the so-called insurrectionists. And but so there's that trivialization that takes place. And on the other hand, look at all those youth activists. It's pretty incredible. It really is, right? So look, in America, Trump is still in the news all the time. And why is that? The guy, should be in jail. You got a big time criminal, right? Who hasn't even been indicted yet. And he gets a lot of attention still. Why? Because he sells stories. That's how he got there in the first place. He knows how to manipulate all of that. And everyone is prone to it. And so this whole question, it's a trivialization. I think your point of trivialization, I think that you really said a lot with that. I think that's a great, great point. And how do we overcome that trivialization? Maybe that's the article you should write.
Thank you.
And let me remind you all about this wonderful event we held at Hacettepe's Land Ethics Center on the Earth Day. That was April the 22nd, and Professor Tamashev talked on his very important book, 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus. And that event is on YouTube at the moment. Please watch it, and because at the moment universities around the world are just catching up with this book to become sustainable campuses. Okay, any other questions?
I think that's all.
Okay, that seems to be the end of this event. All right, thank you so much, Professor Tomashow, for sparing your time, for being with us. You talked about a lot of issues. You talked about your previous books, Bringing the Biosphere Home, 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus. All these books are about getting a deeper insight into knowing the world. These books are all wonderful for environmental awakening. Today you talked about this challenge of migration, social networks, cosmopolitan bioregionalism, perceptual reciprocity, which is for a deeper awareness of organisms. And I'm especially intrigued by your words on this idea that habitats perceive. I'm really thrilled with this idea. So thank you so much. And hope to see you again. We are delighted to have you. We will be delighted to have you again with us. And I think that concludes our event. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Maybe, yeah, Professor Tomashow, maybe you will have a few words, concluding words.
I want to thank everyone for attending. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to my language, which is English as well. I appreciate that. And again, stay in touch with me, please. And best wishes to everyone for your work. Thank you. And thank you so much, Ufuk, for bringing me now twice. It's very enriching for me and very inspiring to see all, to just know that you're all there. I appreciate it.
And that concludes our meeting. You may leave. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending.